Dune Spice Wars is a wonderful 4X real-time strategy blend that's a little bit dangerous around the edges. In this video, I'm going to give you some essential tips and tricks to help you survive. There are time cards below to each section. Let's jump straight in. First up, scouting is the most obvious place to start. You start with an ornithopter, one scouting unit, and you can make your way through, crucially, to that first spice. You'll usually spawn next to one, find it, and then look to find the village in the territory. It might be relatively far away from the spice itself. If you're interested in a breakdown of the first few turns and all of the different yields, here's mine. It's my beginner's guide. It's available right now, already on my channel. I'll take you through Solari, which is money, Plascrete, which is your building material, manpower for units, and so on, so you can feel free to go and check that out. Back to scouting though, check out these rewards. One here from a random location that my scout found, kind of like a goodie hut, in this case it's a crashed piece of technology, will award me another unit, so I don't need to build a scout, I can get it for free. Next, let's talk taking land. So you've scouted out, you've found the spice, the most important resource of all. More on that later, of course. Now it's time to take it. This one, Owaz, had 2 militia next to it. I could tell by the little 2. So sending 3 units will be more than enough. I can take the village using my military might or other ways, but we'll stick to the most basic conquest here for the early game. And then with water and authority, I can expand. They are the 2 expansion-based resources. Next up, we have to talk about actually harvesting the spice. Spice is everything in Dune Spice Wars. Go figure. When you establish your village next to your spice, you'll then be able to produce a harvester once you've built the spice harvesting development. So make sure, like I did here in the video, backtrack if you missed it, you build that. Once that vital development is built, you can then send your harvester out. Here you can see I'm doing it. You do have to manually deploy it, by the way. It's not enough to just build the infrastructure that I have here under the economy section in the buildings for the village. You actually have to send this harvester out. Make sure that you do. The harvesters themselves are also at incredible risk, and if you're not playing as the Fremen, and by the way, throughout this entire video, I'll try and give the most generic advice I can, so I won't be focusing on the Fremen who harvest differently. I'll be focusing more generically on harvesting spice using these big, bulky, mobile, factory-like harvesters. The downside to them is that they're very loud and susceptible to attacks from giant sandworms. You will have seen me here in this video, as I sent the harvester out, I put it on auto-deploy or redeploy. That will ensure that when a sandworm attack comes in, my harvester gets the absolute loving F out of there, and we can actually do what we need to do. Now, here you can see one running away from a potential sandworm attack. Make sure though when they run away that you go back and manually redeploy them. This that gets me all the time. Head over to the right hand side of your screen where I'm mucking around with these units, hit the harvester and send it back out. They will automatically auto recall, but they won't auto redeploy. Make sure you manually redeploy them. If you take away anything from this video, it should be that. Always manually redeploy your harvesters. Now you might be wondering, what's the deal with spice and why is it so important? But first, a quick tip. You can also use manpower to assign crew to your harvesters. Make sure that you do that. You can see it increases the yield by around 5 spice. It has a big difference if you're harvesting many spice fields. Spice is fundamentally important to, of course, pay your taxes. Failing to pay your taxes will result in lower Landsraad standing. Making a diplomatic victory very hard for you, more on that later, but also impacting other yields, most notably the exchange rate between spice and gold. Here it is up in the top left at this specific one. I'm having to convert all of my spice to gold and my economy is still tanking. The key to paying your taxes is to avoid this downward spiral. If you don't pay your taxes, you produce less gold because you're producing less spice. Gold is called money. Technically, it's called Solari, just to be technical and correct here. It will lead to a downward spiral. You can avoid it once or twice, but you can't afford to sustain the lack of spice, the lack of gold, the lack of influence, the lack of authority that it eventually leads to. So do make sure that you pay your spice taxes first and then try and make money afterwards. The downward spiral of then falling into unrest, having rebels turn up, take your territories, you then don't have the villages required to produce your manpower or resources. You can see it's a slippery slope. So my top tip here for this section is to avoid that slippery slope and pay your taxes. Paying your taxes will get you through. Don't do a Jimmy Carr. Moving along to city building, your actual city itself is the only sort of quote unquote, and to use normal 4X language here, which I'm going to do throughout this video, is the only sort of city territory Here you can see there are lots of districts that can be built within it once you reach 2000 hegemony. Hegemony is another victory condition in this game. Once you reach the cap, you can win by doing various actions you can see on screen right now. But crucially, for the early game in particular, you need to get your score, or your hegemony, to 2000 by capturing villages and completing military conquests and various other things. You can then build these very powerful districts that have bonuses as well if you can stack multiple types of the same district within a district cluster. You can see that the benefits are extreme, but you probably won't unlock them until a little bit later in the game, so focus on villages and getting your core resources online first. Speaking of, we might need some military tips to help connect these villages. I'll take you through some aggressive tips and some defensive ones along the way here. Firstly, your military is largely defined by your command points. You can always check them over on the right-hand side of the screen. Armies will cost command points, and you will command a certain amount of base points. There are, of course, different houses that are better than others at this, obviously, but in general, you should look to the development tree, or the tech tree in Dune Spice Wars, to really up your command points. Technology is, of course, achieved through knowledge, which can be built through city infrastructures, and that's really the best way to pick it up early on. Use that knowledge to grab things like this. Ground command, +8 command points. There are also other handy bonuses in here, like defensive districts or buildings that can be built to give your units loads of extra strength, and adjacency bonuses as well to nearby connecting districts, like from the military base, or you can buff your militia. More on those in a minute. But by and large, I would encourage you to explore this side of the development tree in particular, because you'll want to probably have, around the mid-game, at least a military of around 6 or 7 units, particularly if you're spread fairly wide, you might need more where that came from. Which nicely segues us through into defense. Defense is really important. Now, you can use some of these developments and infrastructures to do that. Airfields will let you move units around quicker around the map to other airfields, so you can quickly come along and defend. The missile battery, though, is perhaps the most powerful. It has a high upkeep, though, at 6 gold or solari, 6 plastic, and 4 manpower. That's potentially the most harsh impact of all. But these things are amazing. You can also build them in very clever spots. Here you can see I've placed this missile battery slightly to the right of this village, so it includes the next village, Adras, within its range. That means I kind of get a 2-for-1 out of this missile battery. I'm only paying one version of the up cost, but I get it to defend 2 cities. It's a nice take, especially when the AI is goofing around like they are here. Other defensive tips really come through with the establishment of your city militia, and I'll show you those in a little bit further along, but I should note here that militia may not be enough to defend your city. You may need to have actual military units nearby to airfields, or however you can move them around the map. The Fremen can ride the worms underground, for example, so you will have multiple movement options to get around and defend. But by and large, make sure that you have units nearby and able to attack. Now, when you're going on the aggressive or the defensive, because they play out fairly similarly, make sure that you have at least 1 or 2 ranged units. I'm a huge fan of the smugglers sniper unit, so if you're playing as them and you get access to their ranged unit, you should go for it. Take care though, because some of them, particularly the more demolition focused units, do have a splash damage that could hit your units as well. So take care around the edges with how exactly you are defending in Dune Spice Wars. Thankfully, the military is relatively not restricted, but confined in this game. It's powerful and it's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. You can use these defensive buildings and a few defensive city militia to really protect yourself. Here you can see I'm adding some militia to my cities. The benefit of adding them is that you'll have units nearby to defend. The downside is that you can't manually control them. However, they are roughly 1/4 the price of a normal unit. It's usually a good idea to at least max them out in territories where you have spice. Speaking of spice, trade is awesome in Dune Spice Wars, and it's a really easy to use system. It's particularly useful in the early game where you may have, depending on the faction or house that you're playing, certain weaknesses or strength that you need to plug. My most recent game, I had no money whatsoever. The one before, I had a shite load of money and no building materials. Trade is your biggest friend. Look at this very simple user experience. You on the left, them on the right. The green arrows around resources indicate the player's sort of feelings or how highly they value it. Green arrow obviously means they want it a lot more. A red down arrow means that the player's not really interested in it. It's worth less to them. You can use that to your advantage. The arrows in the middle indicate up or down, whether it will be a success or a failure. You just need one arrow to have it be successful, by the way. So you can really min-max, add in, take things away, use control or shift while you're clicking to add in large amounts as well. A really quick and easy way to use the system. And finally, there are some treaties involved here as well. They cost authority, so you won't be able to expand as readily. You can potentially force them if you're playing as the Atreides, but by and large, you want to try and focus on trading, filling in your gaps, and just getting this deal across the line. The AI does have a reluctance to really pull the treaties in, but with the base resources, you should be totally fine to trade away and just ensure it's a positive trade. Next up, let's talk geopolitics, and in particular the Council. The Council puts forward resolutions regularly throughout the game. Every faction can vote using their votes, which are determined by their standing with the Council. When you mouse over it, you've seen me already do that. And influence, which is a yield that you can generate, whether it's through your own natural generation abilities as your house, or through your agents and espionage, more on that in a minute, or even districts that you've built. Some resolutions, called charters in the game, are more powerful than most. The 5 along the top of the screen. You need to meet certain preconditions to get them. It's not as simple as just the resolutions come up and you put your votes or influence in yay or nay, support or decline. These charters up the top are extra special. You'll need your influence, and depending on the charter, extra skills or territories to go along with it. A certain amount of money, a certain amount of resolutions needing to be accepted, a certain standing with the council, so on and so forth. These positions are very powerful though. The Speaker of the Council gets to re-roll a resolution before everybody votes on it. That's pretty good. Some of these resolutions are very powerful as well. They can give you literally a whole load of free units. They can let you train specific units. They can weaken an opponent's capital to the point where it can't fight back. And it takes double damage. So don't underestimate the power of influence generation and votes in keeping the council on side. Ultimately, here you can see I'm vying to be elected as Speaker of the Council and eventually going for this, Dune governorship, the victory condition that can be achieved through diplomacy, through votes and keeping the council on side, paying your taxes, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, potentially leading to a victory for you through diplomacy and defense. And this game does a really great job at requiring you, or I should say enabling you, to pick and choose. Moving along to the right of the Landsraad Council to the espionage menu, let's talk agents and operations. Agents are unlocked throughout the game, actually determined by real-life time. At certain intervals, you'll unlock more agents. Agents can be assigned to different postings and give different bonuses. They'll also generate intel, which can be used to activate these sort of one-off abilities or effects called operations, which can ultimately also lead to you winning the game. More on that in a little bit. Either way, your agents are unlocked on a timer. You can do certain things to increase, or I should say decrease this timer, particularly in the developments tree. Pick your agent. Each one has their own little abilities and promotions as well, so do take care of that when you're assigning them, and then chuck them in. You can either chuck them in onto other houses to infiltrate those houses. This will generate you a lot of intelligence on them. Or you can infiltrate different areas of the planet, Arrakis itself, the Spacing Guild, the Landsraad Council, these different organizations that are playing out that aren't playable houses, each one generating different yields. And also, depending on your level of exposure, unlocking these missions over on the right-hand side of the screen. These really require a full deep dive. If you'd like to see me go through that, I'm so happy to. I'm planning a video around victory conditions in Dune Spice Wars, so maybe it'll fit in there. But either way, these abilities are very powerful, ranging from literally assassinating other players to win the game towards the very end, down to simple things like exploring a territory through probe setup, poisoning reserves, gear sabotage. You can weaken enemy power in a region, cut off their supply, or force a ceasefire even. Thank you very much for joining me today in Dune Spice Wars. I hope you've found these tips and tricks useful. Moving forward, I plan to cover this game a lot more. If you enjoy it, why not like the video or subscribe? Become one of us. I'd love to have you here. It's a really great game. I'll be live streaming some more of it soon. Thank you very much for watching. and I'll see you for some more Dune next time.